and thank you so much for taking the time to join us for what I think you're going to find to be a very enjoyable conversation. My name is Yuka Yoneda. I'm the VP of Marketing at Prove, and I'm thrilled to introduce Wirecard, the fascinating downfall of a fraudulent fintech. And if this is your first time hearing about Prove, a quick word about who we are and what we do. Prove is the modern way of proving identity, and we enable businesses to provide frictionless consumer experiences while also enhancing security. Our customers have reported results such as 79% faster onboarding, $850 million in additional annual sales, and a 75% reduction in fraud using our unique technology. More than 1,000 businesses, including 9 of the top 10 banks, rely on Prove to accelerate revenue, improve customer acquisition, and mitigate fraud. So if you'd like to learn more about us, feel free to scan the QR code on the screen or go to prove.com. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach Anderson-Pettit, U.S. Content Director at Money20, to get the conversation started. Thank you so much for being here, Zach.
Thank you, Yuka. Appreciate you. And Marianne, Dan, good to see you again. How you been? I haven't seen either of you since Amsterdam.
Yeah, Zach, doing great, fighting fraud.
Absolutely, doing good, Zach. It's fun to get together again.
It is. So let's catch people up. So last time we got together, we had a very similar conversation on the Money 2020 stages in Amsterdam. It was just so fascinating that we actually got invited back for that little encore moment. And I think still at the end of it, both Dan and Marianne got completely bombarded by people with curiosities and questions. And I was able to sneak right by because I was just the moderator and I'm just asking the questions. Nobody cares what I think. But there's still more questions to ask of both of you and some things to like go back and, kind of rehash a little bit when we actually have more time. So I'm glad we're finally doing this. And let's set the stage with you a little bit, Dan. You've written many a thing, but one of the things that we need you to give a little bit more context on so that this whole conversation really makes sense is, well, I guess it's kind of the book. It's kind of the actual Netflix doc. It's kind of your life has turned into, Scandal with a K a little bit. So tell us about the documentary. Tell us about Wirecard. Tell us about the book. Just catch us up to this thing that you uncovered, and then we'll go from there.
Oh, well, thanks, Zach. Well, I mean, this is one of those stories where, as a journalist, you're always told, don't become the story. And this one gave me no choice. It picked me up by the ankles and turned my life upside down. And what happened broadly is that there was this fintech, called itself Europe's answer to PayPal. And it had this background in money laundering. But there was something about it that it just seemed too good to be true. So I start digging into it. And the more I dig, the weirder things become. Private detectives start following people around. Hackers are trying to break into our emails. Bribes are being thrown around. And we very quickly realize something is off here. But it just goes to bigger and bigger things, becomes one of the biggest companies in Germany, if not Europe. And as we continue to try and expose what's really going on, it starts to bring the government in on its side. And suddenly, even though we're publishing stories say there's fraud here, we're the ones who end up under criminal investigation. And it all reaches ahead when finally we discover the money isn't there. And the whole thing collapses in the blink of an eye.
Does anybody else feel like Dan's reading the book to them? Is it because that's my as I'm sitting here, I have the book. I still have the signed copy that you gave me in Amsterdam. That I think you still owe one to Marianne. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, I do.
I think you gave this to Marianne, and I was like, "But please," and then you gave it to me.
Don't worry, I've got a special one for Marianne.
How many times have you been asked to rehash that? Because that was the most impressive rehashing that I think I've ever heard of a story. Do you have to do that like once a day at this point?
Oh, I do it every morning before breakfast. It's part of my daily mantra.
Okay, so in the US we sing happy birthday while we brush our teeth. You tell the story of Wirecard over again while you brush your teeth. It all makes sense now. Okay, that's how it works. Marianne, over to you. So Dan has been uncovering, I think, different frauds, and there's a big difference between uncovering them, I think, and fighting them, or being able to kind of pull apart especially some of like the technical nuances. So you've been doing that piece, kind of the fighting piece and the finding piece for a while. How does this story to you kind of just like resonate with your everyday life? How does, what comes to mind for you when you start thinking about the Wirecard and the, scandal story?
Well, when I start thinking about it, I keep thinking, Dan, I've been living it. I've been living it. And, fintech has a fraud problem. So if we think about it, just today, Airbnb announced they took 59,000 properties off of the site. Can you imagine showing up for your beautiful hotel in Florence, Italy, and it doesn't exist, and you have to scramble to try to find another place to live. So what's happening in fintech is you have this situation where, and I see it daily where, the fintechs are announcing, well, we have acquisition numbers of 10 million customers, and we have, all these great profits. But in reality, you really look at it, PayPal had to announce 4.5 million in 2021, fake accounts that they had to remove from their portfolios. So we're really looking at an identity crisis, in fintech. So we're really looking, and that has lots of implications that tie into, what Dan had to experience where, you're having, these are numbers that you report to the street. These are numbers that are audited. These are numbers that, you have a portfolio of dormant accounts from an unhinged risk appetite that happened at the fintech. So there's lots of nuances around, how little things can become big things that Dan experienced and what we're also seeing in the fintech world.
So I got to ask, Dan, I don't know if you've noticed this about when we ask Marianne a question, but she always has an example from today. Have you noticed that? Like, and she always has it's within the last like 24 to 36 hours, which partially I view as just wildly impressive, Marianne. Two, I view as apparently we have a fraud epidemic, right? Like if you're able to come up with these kinds of numbers and these kinds of examples on a there's no way that this just happened to be scheduled on the right day and Money 2020 Amsterdam just happened to be scheduled on the right day. I have a hunch when we get to Money 20 Vegas, you're, probably I'm going to see you walking around and you're going to be like, hey, did you hear about the thing this morning where there was, whatever number of accounts on this thing? Like, it seems that there's always one. I did not know that 59,000 Airbnbs had been taken off. That is absolutely wild. But how often, I mean, this is, a little bit of a digression, but how often are you finding these? Are you just bombarded with, do you have a Google alert on? How do you find it?
Well, I'm like Dan, I crave this information. I really go out there, I look for it. Let me give you another anecdote. This is even interesting. I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago and listened to several panels, and FinCEN actually was on the stage, and this is a regulator here in the U.S. and they it's pretty interesting. Post-COVID, they took a look at all the SARs that were submitted in 2021, which was 3.8 million, which was an increase over year. And they, the new director of identity had just taken, Kay Turner had just taken her role at FinCEN, and her team came to her and says, we have an identity problem. We have an identity problem. And what was interesting is, so she said, well, quantify it. So she set up something called the Identity Project, and the Identity Project has been digging down into these SARs. And their first glance, they said out of these 3.8 million, 3 million of them had identity irregularities. And at the conference in DC, they went even further and said that 1.6 million of these were specifically fraud and were specifically related to $212 billion. So part of that was public sector funds being funneled through the banking system. But if you think about that, and here's where we need to connect the dots. If you're filing the suspicious activity report and you're trying to say, who done it? You've got a victim's name on the SAR. It's not the person who committed the fraud necessarily. It's Marianne Miller's name, it's Dan's name, it's Zach's name. It's our names that are on those SARs because the identity that was being used to actually money launder, to commit the fraud, synthetic identities, all of this is all entwined. So it makes it really difficult. The SAR process is intended to form attribution, to really look for the suspect, look for who done it. And this makes it very difficult.
So there's kind of two things there to pull apart, right? I mean, from your previous answer and this one, there's a little bit of, it sounds like there's a little bit of outright criminal hope sometimes, right? I mean, I think where we got to Moneyman was like, yeah, let's go illegally make some money. But I would say, I mean, I don't know, I haven't read the Airbnb news, but I would guess that there was a certain culture of, we need to hit the numbers, right? And a little bit of like, it's, we like those 59,000 properties. So how much of what you two see, and I imagine it's probably quite different for the two of you, and maybe even a debate, but how much of fraud, or, whatever word we want to attach to it, is a slippery slope of culture where good people end up in bad situations, and how much of it is bad people perpetrating bad things?
I'll let Dan go ahead on that one first.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is incentives.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you were saying there about, all these different examples of fraud where we discover, hey, a large part of the business wasn't quite real, or our active user numbers turns out real. They're not really that active anymore. All of those, we've had, the best part of a decade where if you could show growth in eyeballs or users or accounts, venture capitalists would come along and drown you in money, as would stock market investors. So there was a bit of an incentive to try and show growth at any cost. And you see this time and again, it's sort of the business has all the incentives in the wrong way. Even, the Wells Fargo with the jumps to mind, where they had an incentive just to, show growth. So who cares who the accounts are and whether they're even real? And I think you see that a lot of time. And a lot of it just hinges on who wants to do the faking. So the Wirecard example, they were not faking people, they were faking businesses for a long time. If you want to launder money in payments, what you do is you find a patsy, a sort of an online address, so you can say, yes, the money isn't really going to my casino or my sort of dubious campsite. It's going to a bakery in this small town. And yes, they're doing really well. It's that sort of thing. And I think what happens is the way that these snowball and become much bigger is the small crimes become bigger crimes. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't get caught, well, we seem to be getting away with it. What else can we do? And it's sort of one hop, skip, and a jump into the next thing. And then you have the incentives and the pressure that builds. Because to begin with, it's great. But as soon as you start faking it, you're creating this problem for yourself, because you have to keep faking it, unless you can go and somehow make it up, make it better. Well, you still got to hit next quarter's numbers. And how are you going to do that? I think we're going to have to do a bit more fakery.
Yeah, and Dan, I would also say that if you look at that and the fakery, and there's, these fintechs, some of these fintechs have good products. They have actually worthwhile products that people want to use. And it's not that much of a stretch to really put in the right controls, the right control framework for digital identity proofing and ensuring that your business is as safe as it can be. And, that the 40,000 applications last night in the queue are not from the ad we put on Meta or the tweet that went out on X. They really are fraudsters at your door. But ensuring that reputational risk that, you don't want to be on the front headlines. You don't want to be like the Airbnb CEO today had to announce, there's almost 60,000 properties had to be taken off. Can you imagine the customer confidence that, that really, sets back a consumer pretty hard. You don't have to be there as a business. If you don't choose. Back to we were talking about that culture of fraud. And I sometimes refer to an unhinged risk appetite, and when I was working with the teams and we're looking at onboarding and we're looking at, what controls do you need? And, the question of, I would ask them, what's your risk appetite for identity theft? Really? Are you okay with your family's identity being stolen and put on our platform? It would kind of go to a quiet room. So it's definitely around making sure that, you don't end up on the headlines.
Yeah. So I think that like the perception and the word of perception, I think, is one I want to lean into. But before I get to perception, I want to remind all those that are listening that we do have a Q&A feature. So if you want to go down and ask a question, just click on Q&A, toss a question in there. And depending on my ability to multitask, I will grab it and ask it at the time that makes sense. So perception. As you were talking, Marianne, I got to thinking about we're 3.5 weeks out from Money 2020, so I spend a lot of time looking at people's LinkedIn's that are trying to get like on stage last minute, or that are trying to pitch crazy things. And yesterday, actually, I got pitched an interesting one. And I clicked, they have like the 3 experiences, you click back for the 10 more, whatever. And then right below the fold, as if it was purposeful, was, I forget the exact title, but it wasn't very high up, but it was at Wirecard. And I kind of had this moment of like, oh shit, like, I wonder if the reason that was right below the fold where you got to click the button is because of perception, or if they just happen to have that many jobs and that's the way that LinkedIn works. So I think my question, and it's to both of you, but specifically to you, Dan, just because you were so close to the Wirecard piece specifically and talking to employees and whatnot, how, in a culture of fraud, how far do you, and it's probably different for every organization, I'm doing a lot of caveating here, but how far does that culture go, or how far can it go, right? Like if I'm having a conversation with maybe not like a VP that used to be at Wirecard, but somebody that used to be on the product team, or somebody that, is like middle management or something like that. Like from your perspective, no judgment associated with any of those people, but from your perspective, do you think there's some awareness there? Do you think there's a gut instinct that there was probably something going on? All of this knowing that you have no ability to actually know. And that's my last caveat. What do you think?
So one of the fascinating things that I got to experience as I wrote the book was going and talking to all the people who worked at Wirecard and had thought that I was the devil. I was trying to bring down their great company. And I spoke to all sorts of different people at different levels who at times had nagging doubts or questions in the back of their mind about, that seems a bit off. The chief exec in the turtleneck is strutting about the stage talking about how we're using amazing AI, whereas my experience of the shonky technology I'm forced to use every day, which barely holds together, there seems to be a bit of a mismatch. But you put that down to, well, it's just marketing, right? Or, you explain it away because you're in your silo doing your day-to-day business. And the way Wirecard worked was everything in silos, countries, businesses. And it had this gold mine. And I think what gets to the culture is you've got these 2 different aspects. You've got the people who are near it and choose not to ask questions. I've got this nagging sense of, literally someone said this to me. They were part of a program who were beginning to, put some procedures in place, think about compliance and that sort of thing.
Ooh,
and he told me, so the more he learned about it, and he says, so we've got this business over in the corner, which is making basically all of the money. It was doing $500 million in profit. And he said, if you can do that with 6 people, what do you need the other 6,000 for? But at the same time, it wasn't his job to try and peel back the curtain. He was sort of involved in a process, and he was he was sort of in this structure of pretend accountability that they had set up sort of to divert those questions away. And I think those people were able to tell themselves, it's not my responsibility. There are more important people who are in charge, who are asking the right questions, or will be on top of that, I'm sure, even as, you know, this nasty newspaper is writing stories about them.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other culture, which, again, I mean, we've spoken about this before, is how do you suck people in to actually do the dirty work? Because at a certain point, you have to ask someone to cross a line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way you do it, again, is it's in small steps. So my favorite example is this young kid who's in the finance department where a bunch of frauds are happening in Singapore. He's 30 years old, no CV really to speak of. It's very thin. And suddenly, the most charismatic guy in the company, he's actually the one behind my shoulder, Jan Marsalek, that super wits kid, totally smooth, can talk for hours, people fall in love with him. And this kid does. You know, he starts trying to dress like him, sort of the same sort of very sharp suits. And Marsalek starts off asking him to do little things. Can you receive some parcels for me? Can you help me out with a couple of problems? And that within the space of, I don't know, 6 months, a year, this kid is full on cooking the books and teaching other people how to do it. And he sees this as his way to get promoted. And it's always the question, you know, in your mind is, what was he telling himself? I think he was justifying it as cutting corners and helping out. And, you know, we were just hitting the profit targets, not that he had fully consciously, certainly in the beginning, decided, oh, yes, I'm going to get involved in the accounting fraud.
Yeah, probably not. Well, and if you're that age and you know, somebody of Jan Marsalek's ability to speak with a silver tongue walks in, you might also just assume like, oh, this is how business works when you skip a few levels, right? Like if you're just kind of pushing paper around and somebody walks in and they're like, oh yeah, lying is standard, right? Especially, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
living in, you know, certain areas of the world, that's not saying that's a standard thing, but like, you know, you get there a little bit quicker. And that
they called him their chaotic genius, was how he was referred to inside the company. You know, everything seemed a bit weird and bizarre and chaotic, but hey, it seems to be working. Look at all the money we're making.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
Dan, I really liked your comment about perceived accountability, because if you're a head of fraud or even a chief risk officer, you know, within a fintech, say, and you don't have a seat at the table, or maybe you even stand up on the table if you have to, it can, if there's a culture of fraud or, you know, looking the other way, then it's a perceived accountability. Oh yeah, we've hired this head of fraud, or we've hired this chief risk officer, but actually they have no empowerment. They have no influence within the organization because actually we've got to make the numbers, you know? So I really think that's a real interesting thought and concept, you know, when risk doesn't have a seat at the table.
I'm so curious to see how this whole FTX trial goes. And as we're talking, I'm just like, oh my God, I can't wait to watch this whole thing unfold. Like the overlap is wild. Dan, you just referenced Jan Marsalek, and we have a question in the chat, and you just happen to bring the name up. So I'm gonna connect the dots here. The question is, and we actually talked about this the other day, is what does Dan make of Jan Marsalek being a handler of a group of Bulgarians who were spying for Russia? So maybe you can give us a little bit of background on that whole Bulgarian situation and what you think of it. And then we'll get back to this stuff, but a little bit of an aside.
So I have to be quite careful about what I say, because there are now active criminal proceedings against 5 Bulgarians who've been charged with spying for Russia. And the quite extraordinary thing this week was that it was a very brief hearing. The magistrate stood up, so the prosecutor stood up in front of a magistrate and outlined the charges and said that Jan Marsalek, the former Fintech chief operating officer, was the one who was directing the activities of these 5 on behalf of Russia. And if you're not familiar with the story, that will be pretty wild, and I think it's pretty wild as well. But and even now, knowing everything that I know about all of this, to see it said like that is quite astonishing, because I think one of the craziest moments in the whole Wirecard story is sort of early 2019. And we're at the point where we have been working away and we've published our big story. Fraud at Wirecard. We've knocked, I think, 8 billion euros off the company's valuation at that point. And they've responded by saying, we're crooks. We've leaked our stories to stock market speculators, and all we're trying to do is manipulate the share price. And it seems like the world has gone crazy because the German government goes along with it. They launch a criminal investigation into me and my colleague Stefania, who wrote the first big story. And that seems so hard to understand. Is Wirecard protected? Why is the German government saying it has to do this? And by the way, it bans this form of speculation, short selling in Wirecard stock for a couple of months just to make sure the company is okay. So institutionally, everybody seems to be lining up behind the company. And then there's one morning where my boss, Paul Murphy, this sort of old school hack who has all these amazing sources, nightclub owners, slightly dodgy rich guys, that sort of thing, who have been great for getting stories. So he pulls me to one side and he says, Dan, we need to have a conversation. Leave your phone behind. No electronics. So we go and find a room in the middle of the building. And he sort of says, yeah, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. There's been a lot going on. So I didn't want to distract you from the main thing. But Jan Marsalek, it seems he's been trying to impress some of these speculators in London by flashing around top secret documents. But somehow he's got the recipe for the Russian nerve gas, Novichok. We think Russian intelligence might be involved. And I think I sort of looked at him like he just told me Marsalek had faked the moon landings or something, because it just seemed, you know, when you're through the looking glass and it's what on earth, what is under this stone we just picked up, because it seems completely crazy.
That story gives me goosebumps every time you tell it. It's one of those, like, I think I've heard you tell that story a couple of times, plus listening to you actually tell it in the book. And yeah, I still just goosebumped. Marianne, Dan he's got this Wirecard thing, you know, that we keep talking about over and over again. And I'm sure, Dan, at some point, probably you get tired of talking about this.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I do have other stories now. I mean, I am continuing to be a investigative journalist, receiving tips of fraudsters if anyone is out there.
Interesting. You're not a one-trick pony. Who knew? I thought you were just doing this over and over again. Before we get to those others, and that's kind of you saw the direction I was rolling there. The reason I say that, though, Marianne, is that you've had a storied career in fraud, and you've been around a lot of, I feel like, interesting stories. I'm curious if you have one, I mean, maybe it's not like a Wirecard moment or something that, you know, turns into a Netflix documentary, but do you have like the Marianne Wirecard moment? Like, if you had to pick one story in your career, what would it be?
Yeah, I do actually. I call it The Boys from Brazil. This is my story. It's not related to it's not actually related directly to the, you know, the spy thriller, but it definitely has some twists. So early in my career, actually, I was on a great team. I was working with a company out of San Diego, and we actually did have a solution using artificial intelligence and pattern recognition. Early, and it was interesting how now it's kind of a buzz, but actually it did exist back then, and it was for card detection, and, you know, score transactions to tell what's fraud and what's not. Well, I was assigned to this team on this and flying back and forth to Sao Paulo, Brazil, multiple times. So we were working with the team at the bank. And sure enough, Dan, you'll appreciate this. The head of fraud was a very debonair looking character, you know, and dressed really well in suits, you know, always had maybe 2 cigarettes in each one of his hands. and would take our project team, out for dinner in the evening and very fancy dinners. I thought, wow, this bank has a big budget, But here's the problem that we ran into. During the day, this head of fraud was very disruptive on the project. This project should have taken about 9 months. And here we were, a year and a half into the project, and all the flight attendants on American Airlines knew my first name, and they were making me, ice cream sundaes in the galley. And, we were going back and forth to Brazil, and my air miles were mounting up. But this fraud manager was very, very, very disruptive during the day with the project. Again, super, super friendly and debonair in the evenings. So we finally finished the project. It took us a year and a half, 9-month project. Even then, we were having problems. And the head of operations became a good friend of mine. And she called me up one day and she said, the head of fraud won't let me look at the rules, Marianne, the rules in the system, the rules stopping the fraud. And I said, well, let me have a talk with him. So I gave him a call and I said, your head of operations really needs to be able to look at these rules and look at, what's going on. Don't worry, Marianne, don't worry. We have it all under control. Well, let's fast forward about 3 months later. The head of operations called me and goes, Marianne, on the front page of the Brazilian newspaper, the head of fraud and 3 or 4 of his cronies within the bank have all been busted for fraud. They have a huge card fraud ring going on. No wonder they didn't want a fraud prevention solution in. And it was big. It found out that he had 2 plaques on the back of his office that said he had master's degrees and he never even went to university. So
Whoa.
There was, a big entwined story. So, long story short, the bank did get the system up and running appropriately. But, it's one thing when you're working with the fraudsters actually, and you're, trying to stop the fraud. So that was, I have more stories like that, but that was one of my most interesting.
That's wild. So, I mean, but that sounds in a lot of ways uncoordinated, right? It sounds almost like the opposite in some ways of a lot of what we've been talking about, where it actually is at the end of the day, or at least the way that I'm hearing it, it sounds like it really was just a few bad actors in a silo that were kind of uncovered. And were they benefiting from it personally? Were they like kind of wandering into them? Okay.
That they were actually committing the card fraud. So
gotcha.
If you don't have any rules in place that look at the fraud and actually stop the fraud, then you can just continue to commit. Then counterfeiting was the big thing, counterfeiting the debit card, the credit card. So there was a big counterfeiting ring, and they were making millions. Just millions and millions. And, no wonder they knew where all the fancy restaurants were, yeah.
Yeah. And no, it sounds like they were very good at keeping you in the right rooms with the right databases in the right place with not the other ones. Sounds like they were good at separating church and state there in a very interesting way.
Yep, they were really good. Somehow, the head of fraud made an enemy somewhere along the line, and somebody started looking into it.
So, I mean, I was going to transition into Adani a little bit. And I mean, maybe this is a transition in some way, maybe not, but is there a takeaway here that we should maybe take a moment and kind of synthesize? Especially, I mean, I wrote down what I believe you referred to him as debonair. And I'm wondering if there's a takeaway about the idea of an especially suave head of risk, or especially put together risk folks being, not that, risk folks can't put on a suit here and there or, comb the hair, but like, is there something to be said for being especially questioning of people in certain instances based on kind of how they put themselves together, or based on kind of, it seems like suave or debonair is an overlapping thing that I'm hearing about a lot in terms of these frauds, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. Is there something there?
Well, I think you have to hire someone with experience, Zach. Someone with a track record. Not someone with fake, university degrees. Someone that just, was working at the most recent startup that didn't have a risk position. Someone who understands identity, understands authentication, understands fraud, understands technologies, understands customers, and understands all of that. And it's interesting. I'll sometimes go walk into these startups and as I feel like I'm going way back in my career because the team who's assigned to fraud, risk, and identity really they need educated on, what are the modern ways that you approach this and how do you stop it?
I mean, I was going to add, when you describe that, Marianne, it makes me think how all these schemes, there's always like a guy, right? The one who seems a bit out of place and is the one who is sort of, you just need the guy in the right place. And sort of one of the other examples was, there's a guy called Ray Akavan, who was a great friend of Jan Marsalek's, who was convicted for laundering payments for Ease, the online weed delivery company. And he went to jail for a while. But one of his party tricks was sort of, he would take you out for drinks and he would bring along quite a senior guy from the MasterCard compliance department. It was sort of one of the people who was responsible for launching investigations if, MasterCard had questions about your payments or what was going on. And it was always just that suggestion, I think, there was no overt suggestion that anything was going on. It's just, we're out partying with the compliance guy, and sort of he would be shown off as a sort of like, look who we're friends with. And so I think those sorts of things are always, warning signs. Inside Wirecard, the person who ran the place where all the fraud was happening in Dubai was known as a maniac racing driver. You did not want to get behind the wheel of the car with this guy, especially on the Autobahn where there are no speed limits. And his sort of party trick he would pick up clients going to Oktoberfest and would sort of say, hey, so you want to go fast on the Autobahn, right? They'd sort of just off the plane at the airport, at which point he would reach into the footwell of his car, pull out a racing driver's helmet and strap it on, only for him, not for the passengers, and then roar off down the Autobahn as if like some sort of racing driver. And people inside sort of laughed it off, his obvious complete disregard for traffic laws whatsoever. But he's telling you something about himself when he does that sort of thing, and you should pay attention. Which is also, I think it's a good way into the Adani thing, which I've been writing about recently as well, because they have a guy as well. And so if you're not familiar with it, Adani is one of India's biggest companies, and it's this slightly weird conglomerate. It does all sorts of things: power, infrastructure, ports. It owns a TV station, sports teams. And the person who runs it and founded it, Gautam Adani, back at the start of the year, he was the world's third richest person.
Oh.
But the source of this wealth was the amazing valuations attached to his conglomerate. It had 10 different listed companies, and they were all worth spectacular sums. And then this New York short seller called Hindenburg Research comes along. He's exposed quite a few frauds. He's getting a great reputation, Nate. And
hold on, Dan. That's crazy. Yeah. They're also the one that wrote the thing about Cash App, I think recently. That was one of the most misguided, wildly ununderstood. Like, that's wild that they're the ones that wrote that, because I read the Cash App one they did, and it was basically like a deep dive on not understanding fintech. Like, yes. they were basically just like, hey, this like Cash App isn't paying the right amount of interchange fees or something like that, because they're portraying themselves as a much larger organization than they are, because they're partnered with these community banks. And I read the whole, and I was just like, that's how fintech works. Like, so it's good to know that Hindenburg is doing good work over in the Adani world, because when I read that Cash App thing, I was just like, you guys are like, I thought they were incompetent, candidly. So this is good to hear. Sorry to interrupt.
They also did the what was the hydrogen truck company that was briefly worth about $20 billion.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the company, but
okay. So what Hindenburg exposed the fact that one of their big video demonstrations where they filmed the hydrogen powered truck storming through the desert in somewhere picturesque like Utah, They revealed they had just rolled it down a hill. And that, I mean, that was sort of back in peak bubble when it was a pre-revenue company worth $20 billion. But so, yeah, Hindenburg is worth watching. And so they've written about this company, Adani, and basically they came out with this big report in January that said, this is the biggest con in corporate history. And there's a whole bunch of allegations, but what they boil down to is Adani has friends. It does some very strange business with its friends, which make those friends a huge amount of money. And then that money comes back and is recycled into Adani stock, pumping up the share price. And that's how he became the world's third richest guy. It's just this sort of circular flow of money. And obviously, Adani deny all of this. And it has a bit of a political edge to it because the company is very connected to Narendra Modi, who runs India. Mm. And so we came along and we published a story which sort of basically said, oh, yeah, everybody wants to know who the Adani shareholders are, because unusually we don't know. It has a whole bunch of these funds which own a lot of Adani stock, which is sort of what Hindenburg pointed to, saying, you really want to have a look over there. This all seems very suspicious. And we were able to identify a couple of the shareholders. And what they had done is they had hidden their identity sort of through layers and layers of investment funds and offshore shell companies, a bit like a Russian doll. Through, you know, the money went through the British Virgin Islands to Mauritius, to Bermuda, back to Mauritius, then into India. And the regulators had set out to try and find who the beneficial owners are, and they just couldn't. They had hit a brick wall and they've been trying for years. And so it sort of exposes quite a lot of the weaknesses in the beneficial ownership disclosure rules, in how easy it is to disguise what's happening with all these sort of layers of financial transactions. And it turns out that one of the guys is this Taiwanese businessman whose name keeps cropping up again and again every time Adani has a bit of a controversy. And I won't go into all the details because it gets quite complicated, but there was a whole diamond trafficking scandal. There was another overbilling scandal where invoices for power plant machinery were being sent to a middleman in one place who would then double the price and send them on to Adani, that sort of thing. And this guy keeps showing up. But I should be clear, the Modi government, there have been lots of investigations, but they keep being dropped or cleared or closed. So maybe this is all stuff and nonsense and they're all completely innocent.
It sounds like it. I think that Marianne and I both feel very confident that this sounds like you're just making it all up at the end of the day.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Dan, do you just refuse to put yourself in safe situations? What's the why do you do this to yourself?
I feel like I'm getting drawn to national champions. There's just something about them in the corporate way.
It does seem that way. So within Adani as an example, right? I mean, Indian company, how do you go about, and you kind of alluded earlier to the fact that, you know, you have sources or, you know, always open to sources. But how do you go about uncovering these things? And especially, you know, when you go into the details of an Adani, like that doesn't sound like a thing that one person can really uncover even in years. So is this a team that you're working with to get these things written and out there? Like, I think that's actually something that I kind of had a sense of a little bit from the Wirecard story, but it got so serious that it was kind of forced into just you, right? But is that normal where it gets so serious that it's just forced into one person, or is it normally a team working? How's that function?
I mean, Wirecard was unusual because that became very personal.
Right.
And that was Wirecard's tactic, was to make it personal. You know, if you're having an argument with someone and they attack the person, the messenger, the ad hominem attack instead of, you know, addressing the points, it's always a tell. And that's exactly what Wirecard did. For this one, and for the way the stories work more normally, I mean, what is amazing and wonderful is that it's very hard to do all these bad things without other people knowing. And even if they don't do anything at the time, sometimes they still know and they still feel bad about it. And when it starts to become public, or they see that you're interested in it because you write a story about it, this little switch goes off and they go, yeah, I should do something about it. And they decide to blow the whistle. And every time it happens, it's miraculous and amazing. And so in the Adani case, what I should mention is it wasn't just us. We worked with this group, this network of investigative journalists called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And so they actually were sort of in contact with people who gave them a bunch of documents, which they then shared with us, and we worked with them on that one. And sometimes that's just the way you've got to go with, if you're digging through huge amounts of paperwork, huge amounts of data, then you need to work together and sort of pool your resources. But yeah, the main wonderful thing about this job is every time, a whistleblower walks through the door and says, hey, I got a hell of a story for you.
Marianne, how much does that resonate in your world of like technology fraud fighting? It seems like consortiums are the answer to a lot of things these days. And a lot of that goes back to, databases not talking to each other. And it seems like it's hard for any one company to fight fraud, I think, in a lot of situations, or any one database maybe is a better way to say it. But how do you think about that in terms of, it being a team effort or not, I guess?
Yeah. Well, a couple of different thoughts I have. So first of all, when we start talking about some of the fraud that we're seeing, it's always billions of dollars. 250 billion of COVID relief fund. With the Money story, 2 billion missing. What was it? Whatever that number was, Dan. It was a large number.
Oh, it was enormous.
Enormous, and just recently. And second, and I think you'll find this interesting. There's a group in the UK called the Global Anti-Scam, or they're called GASA, and they're working with CIFAS, and they just did a survey. And this is an astounding number, but it's related to a number of 9.3 billion. But they said 10% of Britons were exposed to identity theft and scams. 10%. That's a huge number in the population that are actually exposed to this. And, the way that happens is through millions of fake accounts, that these accounts end up on these portfolios, because you have to have a place to cash out an identity theft fraud. You have to have a place to cash out a scam. So you have all these scams, and, going back to PayPal's act, LinkedIn removed 35 million profiles, just a couple of years ago. I constantly get, fake invites. In fact, I get a fake invite, then I go on LinkedIn and I look to say, oh, what's the common employer that they put down? Then if you run through and look at that employer, I looked at one the other day and I had 28 pages of identities that were all fake, that are all conducting scams. So they're conducting romance scams. They're trying to make themselves look good on LinkedIn so that they can lure their victims into this romance scam environment. Yeah.
Time out, Marianne. Did you just say they're running romance scams on LinkedIn?
Yeah, that's right. So,
of all places, I'm flabbergasted.
And how they do it, Zach, is they tie it to the fact that I'm a successful person. Here's my profile on LinkedIn. But what they do is they lure the victim in through first forming this relationship. Then they get them involved in these crypto investment schemes.
Of course.
And actually, just this week, speaking of breaking news again, Zach, Chase just announced as of October 16th in the UK, they're cutting off all crypto debit card transactions and faster payment transactions. All that in the UK is cut off. So because of fraud and because of the scams. So what they're looking at is, we've got these portfolios of fake accounts because of poor identity proofing, or that unhinged risk appetite, or the fraud person not having the seat at the table. That's where that needs to be improved, where you need the right answer the question, is Marianne Miller at the other end of this phone presenting Marianne Miller's information in the flow? You've got to answer that question. If you don't, you can, the data breaches have given us all the PII to make that happen, and just present Marianne's information, open up that account, but she has nothing to do with it. Actually, an interesting thing in the US, I'll give you an example in the US market. If you open up a credit card in Marianne Miller's name, she can see that inquiry at the credit bureau, and she can see that account opened up at the bureau and shut that down. But in the US, if you open up a checking account, a DDA account, a direct deposit account, the equivalent of a current account in the UK, you do that over and over again, there's no place for a consumer to go and see how many current accounts you have opened up in the US. It's not recorded anywhere. Yeah. So a bad actor can take my identity, and we have 5,000 financial institutions in the US, and use it over and over, as long as it's not linked to a lending facility. But if it's only linked to, and you know what happens when they open up that account? I call it what goes wrong when you don't get identity right. Check fraud, ACH fraud, dispute abuse fraud, money laundering, human trafficking proceeds, child exploitation proceeds. It gets into human crime, romance scam proceeds. So really this, ability not to get identity right on your platform, whether you're fintech or banking, really impacts your reputation and really affects society. It really does.
And it affects society hugely. Have the two of you ever seen, and we might have actually talked about this backstage or something, just because we tend to get to these conversations, but have the two of you ever seen a show called Trafficked?
Yes.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one yet. I'll check it out.
I'll send it to you later, Dan. This is so actually Mariana Van Zeller, who is the journalist that is the kind of the perpetrator, the protagonist of this show, is going to be in Vegas. So good timing on the changing of the slide, Yuka. Thank you. Money 2020 in Vegas, October 22nd through 25th. She will be there. She's actually going to be up on stage. I'm going to be interviewing her. And what she does is she goes into a different black market, or dark market is what she would say, every week, right? And she will go into romance scams. She'll like go find somebody that's been scammed and like go through the whole process. She tries to get scammed herself. She's followed fentanyl deliveries from like when they get dropped off, at the, like in the ocean, all the way through the lab, all the way to the actual person in the US taking it in, human trafficking. Like it's an absolutely wild show, but it's the only show that I'm aware of that actually shows the human impact of everything we're talking about, right? We talk about money laundering all the time as an industry. And I mean, how long, Marianne, have we been saying that 99% of it goes uncaught year after year? I mean, every year that I've been involved, that's been a stat that we just say, and then we just get another drink and we move on and just kind of carry on with life. And I think what you just said, Marianne, is the reason that we just keep carrying on with it. Like, most people in this industry haven't humanized the issue, haven't humanized the actual impact of this. And like the, Wirecard story is fascinating and kind of sexy and like back alley and like Dan stuck in a room with no cell phone and no Wi-Fi. Like it's a very, it's a unique thing, right? And that grabs people, I think, in a really unique way. But I just, for everybody that's listening, Dan, you too, like go watch Trafficked / like it's just rallying cry to like give a shit about money laundering and give a shit about identity because of the actual societal impact. So I'm really glad you said that, Marianne, because I think we forget that all the time.
Yeah, and Zach, the thing of it is there's technology that can help. Proof is going to be at Money 2020, and if there's anyone listening on this webinar today, if you want to come and you want to learn about how not to be on the front headlines, how not to announce you have 35 million profiles you had to take down, or 59,000, properties off of your website. There's solutions out there. There's better ways to approach your business to really protect it. And, that's something we'd love to talk to you about.
That is a perfect spot. So, you two will be interviewed by my counterpart, Gina Taylor. Or sorry, that's a different Gina. I have so many people in my head. Gina Clark, from our EU team. So we're kind of switching that up. But yeah, I'm super excited to have you two at the show. The final question, before we head out though, and I guess you kind of alluded to it a little bit there, Marianne, and definitely, you know, come to booth 1024, all that kind of stuff. But what else, you know, beyond buying the right software, what else can we do to fight this? Is there any kind of like last moment of last message you'd like to impart to the audience, but to both of you, not just you, Marianne, but Dan, you as well?
Yeah, I think it's a C-level conversation. Oh, sorry, Dan. Yeah.
No,
It's
you
a-
go, Marianne.
Yeah,
Please.
it's a C-level conversation. You know, it's you know, I tell every CEO, whether it's a bank, you know, spend an hour a month with your head of fraud, the person at your organization, and don't ask them about their projects and updates on, you know, business things. You know, just ask them what they're thinking, what they know, what they've learned, what they advise, because that's not done enough. Fraud gets buried, you know, but fraud is making the headlines. And it should no longer, you know, something that gets buried under the chief operational officer or the chief risk officer. And the head of fraud is not at that table where in the critical audit risk committee meetings. So I really think fraud needs to be elevated within fintechs, within, you know, so I think having that conversation is something that's critical. And I think it has to start at the top. The CEO has to make that time. I had the actual privilege of a leader when I was at Lloyd's Banking Group in London. The president of the retail bank met with me every single month. We had that exact conversation, and that was very productive and very, it protected the business in a better way.
I mean, I completely agree, Marianne. I think great points. I would only add, I think it's about that thing, isn't it? Can you look yourself in the mirror each day? And also, if you have that nagging feeling, well, you should really do something about it.
I think that is a beautiful, beautiful moment to end.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. And thank you, Marianne, Dan, Zach. We hope you enjoyed this session.